Okay, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Shani, and this is Shani's Storytime, where I tell real stories about my life, a little bit about me. I'm a mom, I'm a nurse, and I also mentioned in my previous video that I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm asking people to guess what Caribbean island I'm from. So this is part 2 to the first part of my video where I tell a story of how my mother gave me away. This is part 2. So if you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch part 1 because it will make more sense if you watch part 1 before you watch part 2. So here's part 2. So part 1 we left off where I said, the video was about me saying my mother gave me away when I was 3. And it was from my point of view, from what I remember from my memory of me being 3 years old and what happened, why I said my mother gave me away. This video is going to really basically just kind of clear up, hopefully clear up some of the confusion or any questions you may have about what happened from my mother's point of view. And a little bit of my aunt's point of view, my aunt who took me in, right? So I kind of told my mother that story of how I remembered it. And this is what she kind of said. So basically she said it was just her and she had this little girl she has to take care of and she was struggling. And wait, before I tell you that part, I'll tell you something that I didn't know until probably about, I want to say 15 years ago, I found this out from my aunt. She said basically when I was a baby, which of course I don't remember this. So when I was a baby, that she took me from my mother when I was a baby, like few months old, because my mother was, again, she was struggling. She had just recently moved away from home, moved away from the country. She moved to the big city and she ended up pregnant with me. And it was kind of hard. She didn't really have much help. She had brothers there. She had two or three brothers that lived in the city, but they had their own lives. So they'll help when they can because my mother is the youngest. She was the baby of all her siblings. So they definitely tried to help her out, but it was only so much they could do because they had to live their own lives too. So my mother was like, she told my aunt told me that she told my mother to bring her the baby, which is me. So my mother to bring her the baby, and she'll take care of me while she get herself together. And my mother did. So supposedly I lived in the country with my aunt, my grandparents, my cousins, while I was a baby. My aunt also said that basically once I was old enough to start school, my mother took me back. So when I was about 2 years old, my mother took me back to come live with her. Because at this point now, I guess I was potty trained and I could go to school. So while I'm at school, she can go to work. So she didn't have to worry about where or who's going to watch me while she worked because I was in school. So she took me back, which I don't recall any of that because, of course, I was too young to remember. I don't recall living with my aunt before that point where I cried to go live there. But apparently my aunt said that I did. And my mother confirmed that. Yes, she said my aunt did take me in for a little bit when I was a baby to help her to get, herself together because my father, he wasn't helping. My father at the time was in the army. I don't even want to mention it. I'll tell you that story I'll tell you that different story, the whole part of the situation, because there's a lot, right? So yeah, he wasn't really helping, and she was struggling basically. So she took me back when I was old enough to go to school, and I was living with her. She was working 6 days a week, and on the 6th day, because school is only 5 days a week, and on the 6th day I would spend the Saturday with my uncle. My mother, although the family that she was raised in was Seventh-day Adventist and they don't work on Saturdays, my mother did work on Saturdays because she had no choice. She had no other choice, basically. She had a child to take care of and she had to take care of herself and a child. So yeah. So that's my mother said. So basically, yeah. So once I turned old enough to go back and I went back to live with my mother, the part where I now remember, my mother basically said, yes, there was a point where she was struggling so much she didn't really get into the whole part where I mentioned about me crying to go live with my aunt. She didn't really get too much into that, but what she did say was that yes, she was struggling, and my aunt offered for me to come and live with her. She didn't necessarily say that she asked my aunt, if I come live with her. She said considered, I guess maybe she was telling my aunt that I was crying all the time to come live with her, and my aunt was like, send her back. And that's what she did. She sent me back to live with my aunt. Now, I mean, how do I feel about that? I don't regret her sending me to live with my aunt. I think I had a much better life. We were not rich. But I think the way that I was raised, in the household that I was raised in like a Christian household. My grandfather was very religious, very strict. My grandmother, not so much. Her grandmother, I mean, they were much older in age because, like I said, my mother was the youngest child. So by the time my mother was born, all her siblings were like way older than her, except for my uncle who used to take care and babysit me. They were like 2 years apart. But everyone else was, I'm talking about good 10 years, 15 years older than her. So they had already been raising kids. And by this point, by the time I was born, my grandparents were pretty old. They were like in their 60s, 70s by the time I was born. So it was mostly my aunt who did the raising. And like I said, they were in a very strict household. You had to have good manners and all that good stuff. They didn't tolerate certain things. Everything was about school and books and the Bible. School, books, and the Bible. School, books, Bible, and good manners. And we lived in a community where everyone knew everyone. You have to respect all your elders, no matter who they are. You walk past in the neighborhood, you have to say hi, hello. If you don't say good morning or good evening, best be sure my aunt gonna hear about it, and then I'm gonna be in trouble for not saying good morning to Mr. John or good morning to Mr. Jones. So that's how I grew up, and that's how I was raised. But I have no regrets really for growing up with my aunt and not my mother. I'm not saying my mother was a bad mother, because she eventually, years later, had another child. She had a son, and she raised them, and she took very good care of him. And like I used to tell her, like, that's your child, that's your baby. I don't even really exist. But that's not really true. But she had another child, and she took care of him. But, you know, his father was, again, though, his father was somewhat involved in taking care of him, whereas my father was not. Yeah. And that's kind of how that happened. And eventually, years later, my father came back in the picture. Years later, my father came back in the picture. And yeah, I end up going to live with my father. But that's a story for another day. I'm going to end the video here. Thank you for watching. And again, if you have not watched part 1 of this video, go back and watch part 1. This is part 2. And since you made it this far in the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Love you. Bye.